Okay guys, so the purpose of the video is to make sure that you have a very good, accurate, clear, and more precise understanding of something that you learned about in your Learn Smart reading when you're learning more about metaphysics and especially the problem of free will. And for the first, you should have downloaded some original text from Stace, who was mentioned in your Learn Smart text. This video is to help you do better on one or two more paragraphs that you're going to be writing for this week. So I am going to focus on something very specifically that you learned on Learn Smart. And the reason why I'm doing it is to make sure that you have a really good understanding of the theory that you will be working with, the thinking that you will be working with. So you got to make sure that you follow all of the video and that you take really good notes. On that note, you should have downloaded this document right here. You don't necessarily have to print it, but at least be able to mark it up online or take notes as you're going along. I recommend printing it and or downloading it and then maybe using like some kind of Adobe software there's other software that you can use to annotate online documents. I recommend that because you really want to have your notes right next to the text that we're talking about. Now, why are we going to get into this text? The reason why we're going to get into this text is because you are going to be applying some big ideas from Stace's thinking with respect to his view about free will, which is called, by me, self-determinism, by Lawhead, compatibilism. Compatibilism, the way that he's using it, refers to whether or not a lack of free will is consistent with the possibility of responsibility and therefore holding people, saying that people are able to act morally or not. But there's another way to talk about compatibility, and that has to do with just metaphysical determinism, the idea that is if every action, thought, decision is completely and wholly determined by present and prior causes, then one can wonder, is that consistent? If that really is true of reality, is it still possible for free will to be reality? In other words, is the thesis of universal causation or metaphysical determinism consistent with the possibility of free will? So in the written lecture, in the previous portion of your writing, you were focused only on, trying to show how a series and grouping of causes led to your taking philosophy as an online class. So we were just concerned with that. But now we are interested in whether or not metaphysical determinism is consistent with the possibility of free will, and Stace thinks it is. So for the first few pages, all I'm going to do is give you a summary of each paragraph. I encourage you to at least write down the summaries that you see as I walk you through them, because this will help you see how the trees that you will be applying specifically from the theory hang together in the forest. It's very important when you're applying concepts, definitions, using examples, that you understand why those examples work, why those definitions work. What is the context from which they are derived? How do these definitions and examples hang together with the broader part of the theory? That's why I am going to give you some summary points from paragraphs that we will not be reading together. We're only going to read through half of this document together, and that's going to be the portion that you need to apply to your writing task. So this is totally me making sure as your coach and as your mentor, as your guide, that you understand both the context and the specifics of that which you will be applying. We've got to make sure you understand it, and that's what this video is all about. It's here to help you be successful with the next part of your writing task. Keep in mind that because I do create these videos to help you be successful, that I do grade very rigorously. I assume that you listened to every second of this video, that you took notes, and that you did as instructed. Okay, so again, I do my part, so I need you to do your part, not my part, because we're working as a team. Okay, so I create the video, you watch it, you follow it, and whatnot. So let's go ahead and get started. So I will be looking down because I'm going to start working with this text right here. And if you have time, if you have a lot of time, what you could do is you could read a paragraph and then see what I say about it and take notes. So read it, if you want to do that, Pause the video right now, read paragraph 1, and then see what I say about it. I'm going to give you a 1-sentence summary. If you do not have time, then continue to watch the video without pausing it. So that's all I have for you right there. So as you can see, I do have this, the title of the work from which this is pulled is called A Compatibilist Account of Free Will from Religion and the Modern Mind. So this is a book by Stace, and we're looking at, just a few pages from the book. So when he's using compatibilism, he's using it in both the ways that I just talked about. He thinks that everything being wholly determined by causes is compatible with free will, and it is possible to still have free will, but he also thinks that because of this, then of course we can say that we can be held responsible for our actions and talk about people doing right or wrong. Okay, so assuming that if you wanted to read this first paragraph you already have, why don't you copy these notes here? And of course you can pause after I read through this and explain to you what I have. Then you can pause and copy this. I recommend that you do it that way. So here I'm just noting that this is an introductory paragraph basically. He's giving the broader context of what I should say is of what gives rise to his concern about free will. Here I have a little visual, so as you guys know I use concept triangles to show you fundamental and powerful concepts. So he's interested in how, he's saying, hey, there's this concern with freedom or free will or acting freely, and depending on how you define it, you might say that there is no such thing. So this is, saying, are there any examples of freedom based on some definition? He's saying, well, there's some ways of defining freedom such that people will deny that it has any examples, reference, and reality. But if there is no such thing as free will, then define responsibility however you want, or what it means to hold someone responsible. It doesn't seem like this is a meaningful concept. How can you say that people are responsible for their actions in a world where there is no free will? And so that's why I just drew an X. And the arrow kind of means an implication. If we define freedom a certain way such that we deny that there is any such thing as free will, then an implication seems to be that the concept of responsibility, however you define it, is meaningless. Which also leads him to, and I forgot about this triangle so I didn't do him small enough, he says define morality, rightness and wrongness however you want, but it follows that if responsibility, holding people responsible for their actions is meaningless, then so is the notion of right or wrong, or saying that people acted morally or not. Okay, by the way, I have this as page 1, so this is A, B. So next, again, if you want to read the paragraph, you can. If not, don't worry about it. The ones that we really need to read will be, I'll let you know. It's probably going to be like the last 5 pages. Okay, so here he says, he's pointing out how philosophers and he's talking about philosophers and psychologists who deny free will. He says philosophers and psychologists deny free will. FW means free will in this lecture. Live as though there is free will. So if you want to see what he's talking about, he gives you examples of how philosophers and psychologists act in their everyday life. And the way that they act in their everyday life seems to suggest that they do think there is free will, even though in theory and in words, they deny that there is free will. And he says that this shows us that the problem is merely semantic. He says this should cause us to suspect that the problem is not a real one. That is, the problem of free will and whether or not it's consistent with the reality of everything being caused. He says, and this, I believe, is the case. The dispute is merely what? Verbal, a very important concept in his thinking, and due to nothing but a confusion about the meanings of words. It is now fashionably called a semantic problem. Okay, so look at how fast we got through page 1. It's not about that we got through page 1 quickly, really. I'm just letting you know that we are kind of just brushing over some of the context that I think is important, but we will get into the stuff that you are going to be applying in light of having this context in mind. Okay, so in what I'm calling paragraph C, or page 2, he gives an example of how a verbal dispute arises, and he says that this shows that solving, then he links this example to solving a verbal dispute. He says, all you would have to do is show him his mistake. All you would have to do to show him his mistake would be to give him the correct definition, or at least show him that his definition is wrong. So this is an example. You read about this part in your Learn Smart task, where the author talks about how, like, look, if you define a man as a five-legged creature, then you're going to deny that men exist. You're going to say, well, men don't exist because there is no five-legged creature. And so the idea here is that the problem has to do with your definition. We all think that men exist, so the problem is the definition. What you have to do is you have to show somebody that their definition is wrong to help them see why maybe they don't think it exists in reality. As a side point, I wonder if this is true with racism. You know, like maybe some people have a definition of racism that is incorrect or biased or microaggressions, and therefore, because they have an incorrect definition, they're not able to see it. Okay, going back to other stuff. All right, so he says in paragraph D, he says basically the problem of free will and its solution are entirely verbal, that is, having to do with semantics, what words mean. So in here, when I said he's giving an example of how a verbal dispute arises, that's where he's talking about defining man as a five-legged creature, and he wants to say the problem with free will is exactly that kind of a problem. It's a definition problem. Some philosophers and psychologists have been using the word in a way that is odd, leads to absurd consequences, denying that there is free will. He says, the problem has been created by the fact that learned men, you know, so people with their PhDs, very educated, degree philosophers and psychologists, especially philosophers, have assumed an incorrect definition of free will, and then finding that there is nothing in the world which answers to the definition, have denied their existence. And then he says, and he just says, skip this part right now here, the deniers of free will, the problem or the mistake that the deniers of free will have made, especially the philosophers, but including the psychologists, is it's harder to detect the problem with their definition. It's harder to detect. It's more subtle than just saying a man is a five-legged creature. Okay, so now we're on page 3, and we're at paragraph E. All right, so right here he's taking on hard determinism. So remember, metaphysical determinism is a metaphysical theory about causality, that everything is caused, what is called by Lawhead the thesis of universal causation. Hard determinism is a theory about free will, okay? So hard determinism, and that's what Stace is going over right here. He's saying that there are some people who make this they make an inference about free will not existing based on a theory that has nothing to do with free will. It's just about causality or metaphysical determinism. So he says, throughout the modern period until quite recently, it was assumed both by the philosophers who denied free will and those who defended it that determinism is inconsistent with free will. So when he's using the word determinism right here, he is using the word, what he's really talking about is what I already lectured on in writing, and that's metaphysical determinism, or what Lawhead calls the thesis of universal causation. He doesn't mean hard determinism. What he's talking about here is simply the theory that everything has a cause. Now, what I have highlighted in yellow is where he's telling you what is meant by metaphysical determinism. So pretend the if isn't there, right? So that's where he's calling attention to what some people think. Man's actions being wholly determined by chains of causes stretching back to the remote past so that they could be predicted beforehand by a mind which knew all causes. Don't worry about that part right here. Just really, this is the meat of metaphysical determinism. A man's actions that are wholly determined by causal chains of causes stretching back to the remote past. And so he's teasing out the thinking of the hard determinists. So at this point, he's saying, well, here's what the hard determinists say about the possibility of everything being caused and free will. If a man's actions were wholly determined by all this, it was assumed that they could not, in that case, be free. But he says that Stace says this is the incorrect definition for free will, which has led some philosophers and psychologists to deny that there is free will. So the incorrect definition of free will is actions not wholly determined by causes. Some people are defining free will this way, but he's saying this is not correct. So going to paragraph F, he says, but a definition may nevertheless be called correct or incorrect. So he says, look, you can define a word however you want to. Obviously, we can just be arbitrary about it. But he still thinks that there's a standard for deciding whether a definition is correct or not. He says it is correct. So these are key words right here. A definition, correct. It is correct if it accords with something called common usage of the word defined It is incorrect if it does not accord with common usage. So then he goes back to his five-legged, the example of defining man as a five-legged animal. He says, common usage is the criterion for deciding whether a definition is correct or not. So here he's basically trying to argue using his example of defining man as a five-legged creature. He's trying to argue for his standard for deciding whether a definition is correct or incorrect. So we're not going to worry so much about how he argues for his standard. Just know that he has argued for a standard or a criterion for deciding whether or not a definition is correct or incorrect. And so again, he's reiterating here, common usage, so again, that's a key concept, is the criterion for deciding whether a definition is correct or not. And this is the principle which I shall apply. So again, what he's giving us here is the criterion for deciding whether a definition is correct. He says it's common usage. Here he's arguing for common usage as the criterion for deciding whether a definition is correct. And so now he's telling us how he's going to be using this criterion for working through the verbal dispute or semantic problem of free will. He thinks that in doing so, he will be able to discover the correct definition by inquiring how the phrase is used in ordinary conversation, that meaning common usage. And he's doing that through what? He says discover the definition. Okay, in what? Ordinary conversation, that is common usage. Okay, so at this point, I've given you a good sense, a good intro into the text that we're going to deeply analyze to make sure you understand what it is that you'll be applying and writing about. This gives you a sufficient understanding of the forest, of how things connect together, why Stace does what he does next. And I might even give you some extra credit based on your ability to have followed this lecture, but I'll let you know about that later.